Thank you very much, Rich. Thanks to each of you for coming. I want to thank my staff in the Salt Lake Chamber, Rich McKeon for being our MC, and all the panelists, and most of all of you for coming to attend this. Our topic of discussion today has been collaboration, and I've really benefited from hearing these messages. Collaboration is an inevitability that happens in any legislative process, and so it's particularly important in my line of work. I've pointed out to people in the past that sometimes we get two sets of calls that come into our office. One set says compromise anywhere, everywhere, in a box with a fox and a rain on the train. Another set of calls will come in at the same time saying, never compromise, do not compromise, it's of the devil, it's wrong. And it often occurs to me when these two sets of phone calls come in simultaneously, in some ways both sides of that argument are missing some of the point. Because compromise is not a substantive outcome. It's not an end result. It's an inevitability in any legislative process that involves more than one person. To bring about collaboration, you have to have someone convening a meeting. You have to have somebody bringing people together, and you have to have a willingness on the part of those involved in the discussion to accept the legitimacy of other points of view. And what that means in essence is that each person has to be able to articulate what he or she desires most. If people don't have those things, then we tend to descend into a free fall, one in which people will view support or absence of support as a signal that they are liked or disliked by individual members. That's where you get pettiness. That's where you get this sort of catty infighting that you can see displayed in many legislative bodies. That's something we like to try to avoid. When I think about this, I can't but think of a story that I've first heard told by a man named Emo Phillips, who was walking across the Golden Gate Bridge one night very, very late. He was enjoying being the only person on the bridge, or so he thought, when he got about halfway across the bridge. And he saw that he was, in fact, not alone, that there was someone standing on the outside of the guardrail, looking forlorn and looking like they might be taking the unfortunate decision to end their life. He stopped and realized, I've got to talk to this person, or he may end his life. So he said, the first thing that occurred to me was to ask him whether he believed in God. The man said yes, and Emo said, me too. He said, are you a Christian? The man said yes. Emo said, me too. What denomination do you belong to? And the man said, I'm a Baptist. Emo said, me too. Now, are you a Northern Baptist or a Southern Baptist? This discussion was really going well. I'm a Northern Baptist. Me too. Are you a Northern Fundamentalist Baptist or a Northern Reformed Baptist? Well, I'm a Northern Fundamentalist Baptist. Are you Northern Fundamentalist Baptist Conference of 1857 or Northern Fundamentalist Baptist Conference of 1812? And the man said, I'm a Northern Fundamentalist Baptist Conference of 1857. And Emo said, die, you heretic, and pushed him off the bridge. This reflects where sometimes people go, but it also is a stark reminder to us of the fact that in any business, whether it's the business of business, whether it's the business of saving souls, whether it's the business of saving a republic through improved legislation, we all need to be more actively engaged in finding converts, in finding agreement, than in casting off heretics. But in order to get to that first phase, we have to convene. I think about the convening that took place some 230 years ago this summer, when a man from Virginia went to Philadelphia, hoping, expecting, trying to convene. He initially didn't have enough other representatives from enough states to form a quorum to undertake changes that were necessary to make to the Articles of Confederation. He waited. He knew he wouldn't have to have everyone, but he knew he would have to have enough. So he waited until he was able to convene enough to have enough. He then came up with a system that would foster the development of the greatest civilization the world has ever known. And he set up a system that requires collaboration on a grander scale than had been seen in other legislative bodies up to that point, that would confer upon the American people liberty on a grander scale. It would recognize the dignity of the immortal human soul to a greater degree than other governments had recognized it. But it did so by placing certain limits on government, on saying that certain things would have to happen within that system in order to make law. It tried to narrow some of the contention and thus further some of the opportunities for collaboration by splitting up power along two axes, one vertical, the other horizontal. Along the vertical axis, decided to split up power between the states and the national government, with most of the power remaining at the state and local level, understanding that when people are represented at the state and local level, their government is closer to them. It can be turned around more quickly. Putting a few powers with the federal government, but those things that were distinctively national. That's one way they encouraged collaboration, was by deciding who got to exercise what power. They also split up power along the horizontal axis within the federal government by saying when you're going to make law or otherwise take government action within the federal government, you've got to operate in one of three lanes. You've got the legislative lane, that's Congress, that will be in charge of making the law. The executive lane, headed by the president, in charge of enforcing the law. And the judicial lane, headed by the Supreme Court, in charge of interpreting the law. At each of these levels, the Founding Fathers sought to require collaboration on a grander scale than had been required in the past. I'm often asked, what's wrong with Washington? Why is there so much gridlock? Why is there so much rancor? Why is there so much dysfunction? And there is, to be sure, an abundance of each one of those things, to my great dismay and that of 330 million Americans. There are several reasons for this, some of them having to do with the fact that at times the collaboration never occurs. Let me describe a couple of respects in which this manifests itself. First of all, sometimes the collaboration in the legislative branch never occurs in the first place, to the extent that individual members make their legislative agenda about them personally, rather than about a particular policy. This, by the way, occurs not by some deliberate, malicious design. It occurs instead in a vacuum in which members fail to identify that which they value the most, in which they fail to identify what they want, not just what they're against, but what they're for, and why they're for it. To the extent they're able to articulate what it is that they want, members, regardless of where they might fit on the ideological spectrum, left or right or somewhere in between, can almost always become good collaborators. Some of the best people I know, some of my favorite negotiating partners, are people who could not be more opposite from me on the political ideological spectrum. Senators like Cory Gardner, Cory Booker from New Jersey. Cory Gardner is also a friend, but he's closer to me on the spectrum and just across the hall from me. Cory Booker from New Jersey, Democratic senator, quite far to my left. And yet he and I and Dick Durbin from Illinois and Pat Leahy from Vermont have come together around a number of proposals, some of them having to do with criminal justice reform, others having to do with protections for the Fourth Amendment. That collaboration has been made easy because each of them is willing to identify what it is that they're for, what it is that they want, what it is that they expect out of the government. Sometimes the collaboration never occurs because people don't identify what they want. Sometimes it occurs because people are too willing to allow others to exercise their power. When you get members of Congress who show up and are willing to delegate to someone else the power to decide how they're going to vote on a particular issue, the collaboration can sometimes be collapsed. Because even if they can purport to negotiate with someone else, if at the end of the day they're going to vote in a way that someone else directs, someone else within their party perhaps, then the collaboration means nothing, and the collaboration won't occur next time. It might not even occur this time. In other cases still, legislative collaboration fails entirely because it never gets off the ground, because it has been delegated entirely by Congress to the executive branch. Let me explain how this works. Over the last 80 years, there has been a deterioration of these two structural protections in the Constitution I mentioned earlier. The vertical protection we call federalism, and the horizontal protection we call separation of powers. As more power has been taken away from the American people and moved to Washington, D.C., Congress has found itself less capable of making policy, of updating its laws, and therefore made itself more inclined to delegate the lawmaking power to the executive branch. So at the same time that we're deviating from the vertical protection of federalism, we're also blurring the horizontal protection we call separation of powers. Here's, in essence, how it looks. Congress takes a problem. Let's take any problem, a problem we confront sometimes here in Utah, clean air. Instead of passing a law, setting pollution limits, specifying how those limits will work, how they'll be enforced, what the penalties are, Congress will pass something sort of like this. This is a slight oversimplification, but just go with me on this one. Congress will pass a law saying, in effect, we shall have clean air. You'd have to be a complete moron to vote against that. Then there's the fine print, and there is very little fine print. And we hereby delegate to the EPA the task of defining what clean air is, of setting limits on individual pollutants, on deciding what portion of the air cleanup burden will be borne on the one hand by stationary sources like power plants, and on the other hand by mobile sources like automobiles, buses, semi-trucks, and lawnmowers. How will these fees be collected? How will the fines escalate based on the ability of the person to pay, or alternatively based on the severity of the offense? In many cases, all of those kinds of decisions will simply be punted by Congress to the unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats in the executive branch. Now, make no mistake, I don't fault executive branch bureaucrats for this problem. Make no mistake, this is a problem created by Congress itself, specifically because it can make the job of the lawmaker easier if the lawmaker, in fact, doesn't have to do his or her job. But who loses in this? Well, everyone else. Everyone who's not at that table. You see, because as we delegate that lawmaking power, what we see is when people are harmed by a particular law, then the people who were elected to make the law aren't accountable for it. If EPA does something under the Clean Air Act, if, for example, it sets ozone emission levels at a level below where Mother Nature herself has set them, and if that causes certain businesses to shut down, for instance, in the Uinta Basin, and people come and pound their chest and say, please, please do something about this, you have the lawmaker in the position of saying, don't look at me. I just voted for clean air. Go to the EPA with your troubles, with your concerns about this. And the problem there is the people at EPA, as hardworking, well-intentioned, well-educated, and highly specialized as they are, do not work for you. If you live in Utah, you can fire me every 6 years. You just missed your chance this last year, but you'll have another chance again in a few years. With representatives, you've got a chance every 2 years. You can't fire the executive branch bureaucrats. Your ability to fire them is what makes you in charge of your government. And that's why it's so important that this kind of collaboration occur in the first place. That's why it's so devastating that this kind of collaboration never occurred within Congress. Because wherever Congress can delegate, it does. Where it has delegated, it leaves you, the American voter, the consumer, out of the loop. Now, lest you think that this is an esoteric problem, that this is a problem only in some obscure, intangible constitutional sense, this has very deep, devastating real-world consequences. First of all, I keep an exhibit in my office in Washington to demonstrate the severity of the problem. Next time you're in Washington, come to my office, especially if it's on a Wednesday when the Senate's in session. We serve Jell-O at 3:30 every Wednesday. When you come by my office, it's Utah's official state snack for reasons I don't understand. We consume more Jell-O than any state on a per capita basis. I will show you these two stacks of documents I keep behind my desk. One stack is a few pages, a few inches tall. It's a few hundred to a few thousand pages long, and it consists of the laws passed by Congress last year. Another stack next to it is 13 feet tall. For last year, it was 97,000 pages long. And it consists of last year's Federal Register. The Federal Register is the annual cumulative index of federal regulations as they're issued, released to the public for notice and comment, and later finalized. So measured by weight, by volume, by column inch, any conventional metric, the executive branch is making more law than we are. That matters because the very first clause of the first section of the first article of the Constitution says that all legislative power, meaning all lawmaking power within the federal government, shall be vested in a Congress, which shall consist of a Senate and the House of Representatives. Making note of the fact that there's an additional layer of collaboration here that's required, not just between individual elected lawmakers, but between these two houses of lawmakers. If it works really well, but it can't work when we delegate all of it away. Here's another layer to the problem. It's not just that they make more law than we do. It's not just that those people who make the laws in that way are unelected and unaccountable. It's also a problem that this costs the American economy a lot of money. 20 years ago, when I first started following this problem, I was shocked to learn that it was costing the American economy $300 billion a year to comply with federal regulations. It was also troubling to me to learn that these costs were disproportionately borne by hardworking, middle-class, and poor Americans, who disproportionately pay for those higher regulatory compliance costs through higher prices on goods and services, diminished wages, unemployment, and underemployment. In the 20 years since then, that number has multiplied roughly sevenfold, like our national debt. It's now a $2 trillion annual cost to the American consumer. And yet this is all added by a part of the federal government that is not elected by the people and not accountable to the people. And that's where the most important stage of the collaboration takes place, between the lawmaker and those represented by the lawmaker. You see, because when the people who are governed by those laws have the ability to weigh in on them, that's where we get better government. That's where, regardless of where you fit on the ideological spectrum, we can often, not always, but often, find ways to accommodate divergent interests. We can find ways at least to have a fair process, one that leaves you, the American citizen, in charge of your own government. James Madison wrote in Federalist 62 that it'll be of little avail to the American people that their laws may be written by individuals of their own choosing if those laws are so voluminous and complex and ever-changing that they can't be read and understood by those responsible for following them. We're in a position now where not only are our laws too voluminous and complex and ever-changing to be understood, but they're not even written by individuals of our own choosing. We've got to restore that collaboration. I've started a bicameral think tank within Congress called the Article 1 Project, the sole purpose of which is to identify areas in which Congress has excessively delegated away its power, thus thwarting collaboration in both houses of Congress and in the legislative process as a whole, and to look for areas in which we can restore that power back to Congress and therefore to the American people. One of the centerpieces of this effort involves our support for a bill called the REINS Act, a little-known legislative proposal, but one that has been rapidly gaining momentum. REINS stands for Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny. And here's what it says. It says that anytime there's an economically significant regulation, not something that just dictates what time the lights are going to go on and off in the Department of Commerce, but an economically significant regulation, that regulation may not take effect without both houses of Congress affirmatively voting it into law and handing it to the signature to the President for signature or veto. This is the kind of simple mechanism, one that's already dictated by Article 1 of the Constitution, but that we haven't been following in recent decades, that could increase collaboration in the legislative arena better than anything else I know. I want to end by sharing with you my vision, my hope, that the best days of the American people remain yet ahead of us. Winston Churchill is known for saying that the American people can always be counted on to do the right thing after they've exhausted every other alternative. I don't know that he meant that as a compliment, but I take it as such. Because it's one of the things that has differentiated the United States of America from other nations. We have made the right choice. Sometimes we experiment with other alternatives, and when we have exhausted those alternatives, we do the right thing. I hope and I expect that we will do the right thing by the American people by returning to these founding era principles that require our collaboration. Thank you very much.